Hello everybody, you're welcome back again to the Reggae Appreciation Society. On September the 12th, 1987, the world woke up to the horrific news that the great Peter Tosh had been murdered in a robbery gone wrong at his home, a tragedy that also claimed the lives of two other innocent people. The entire global reggae family would pour scorn on the ringleader of the gang of killers for that horrible crime that's gone down as one of the saddest events in Jamaican history. However, in recent times, a shocking string of revelations have exposed the circumstances around Peter's sad passing as the climax of several years of the chaos, confusion, and roller coaster existence which had been the Stepping Razor's life. An unfortunate epoch that had begun after losing the love of his life, named Yvonne Whittingham, in a tragic car accident in 1976, and the general climate of craziness that would go into overdrive after Peter would settle down with a woman named Marlene Brown, the woman who would become recognized as Peter's lawful wife. And while Yvonne was said to have been a calming influence on Peter, Marlene had the direct opposite effect. According to family members, associates, and friends, she not only manipulated Peter, but was said to have been a practitioner of witchcraft and laid a spell on the Stepping Razor. And she not only turned him against his close friends and associates, including Bunny Wailer, who he almost engaged in physical combat on her account, but they also claim that she made him cut off family and made lots of enemies for Peter, one of whom would eventually lead a gang of killers to his house and take his life. And all the while, during the relationship, Peter was madly in love with her and ignored numerous red flags, including an ominous warning from a witch doctor about a light-skinned woman in his life that would bring about his eventual downfall. Let's take a look at the bizarre story of Peter Tosh and Marlene Brown. By 1981, Peter had released his critically acclaimed album, Wanted, Dread and Alive. It had been almost 5 years since he lost his lovely girlfriend, Yvonne Whittingham, in a tragic car crash that left him physically scarred and emotionally devastated. Yvonne and Peter had been soulmates, and she had a way of effortlessly taming him and bringing out his soft side. But after she passed, Peter descended into depression and would morph into his Stepping Razor persona. His wild side returned and couldn't be tamed by his then girlfriend Melody Cunningham, the mother of Jawara and Nyambe Tosh. Peter would confront the authorities at every given opportunity and almost lost his life in the process. But that year, a seeming change would come when Bunny Wailer introduced Peter to the younger sister of his girlfriend. She was 20 years old, really gorgeous, shy, and even bore a slight resemblance to Yvonne. That young lady was Marlene Brown, and she was swept away by Peter's rugged charms, and the couple fell in love in no time. He fell hard for this new flame and would suddenly give little or no attention to Melody Cunningham. Peter's bandmates and friends all adored Melody, but when they saw how crazy he was about Marlene, they all kept their mouths firmly shut. Melody had always followed Peter on tour, but when it was time to go on tour that year, he would leave her at home and take Marlene with him instead. And in those early days, Marlene came across as a shy girl from the ghettos of East Kingston and barely spoke. But over time, she would begin to take over not only Peter's private life, but also his business matters. After finishing the Wanted, Dread and Alive tour, Peter would honor an invitation from his friend and fellow EMI artist, a Nigerian singer, Sonny Okosum, to visit Nigeria. And in February 1982, he and his manager, Copeland Forbes, embarked on a 2-week adventure to that country. And one of the first things on Peter's itinerary was to go and see a powerful witch doctor to get treatment for the bad headaches that he'd been experiencing after getting a savage beating by the police, and to get protection from duppies or evil spirits. So Sonny Okosum took him to see one, and the man warned Peter immediately not to get involved with the light-skinned lady, or else he would face destruction. He gave Peter a loincloth to wear around his waist for protection, but warned him that no woman in his life should ever see it or touch it. And before Peter left, he told Peter again that he had 2 women and one of them would cause him great harm, maybe even lead him to an early grave. After spending time in Nigeria, Copeland Forbes and Peter returned to Jamaica, but despite all the warnings about the light-skinned lady, Peter carried on with Marlene and even took things up several notches. That trip to Nigeria had inspired the music on the Mama Africa album, and Marlene would become a very huge presence during the making of that project. And one of the first signs of what was to come, it would manifest at the World Music Festival at Montego Bay in November of 1982, a massive event that featured Jamaica's finest like Peter and Black Uhuru, but also included international superstars like Aretha Franklin, Joe Jackson, and Rick James. Rick James and Peter became particularly tight friends during that festival, and the Stepping Razor would go and hang out with him backstage, even on days that he wasn't scheduled to perform. So one night, Peter and his entourage were enjoying the show from backstage when they were told that there was a huge fight outside between Marlene and the security guard. Apparently, Marlene was selling t-shirts that she spread out all over Peter's car in the parking lot, and security had told her that it wasn't allowed and offered her an available stall, but she refused and would enter into a shouting match with the guard. Peter had to intervene, but it was so embarrassing that Robbie Lynn, Peter's then keyboard player, found it so disgraceful that he quit the band. In those times, Marlene had begun to throw her weight all over the place, and Robbie Lynn definitely wanted none of it. Peter would soon after buy a home for him and Marlene to live at. This lovely house was at 5 Plymouth Avenue in the lovely Barbican neighborhood in East Kingston, the same house he would meet his end at 4 years later. The couple moved in together, and Marlene would turn that house into something of a fortress for her and her man. Peter had always been a man of the people. He had a large heart and believed in giving, and he also kept it real with all his old pals from the ghetto and supported them as much as his resources could allow him to. And Marlene would quickly put an end to all of that, and would block many people from having access to Peter. But it didn't stop there, as Peter's band members and associates also began to complain. Peter's drummer, Santa Davis, said in a recent interview that Marlene began to manipulate Peter into hating everybody and trusting no one, and from there began to exert influence on the band's business. And one very glaring example of all this was when Peter and his label EMI Records were working on the design for the Mama Africa album cover. Peter and his entourage traveled to Los Angeles for a meeting and were accompanied by a friend of Marlene who was an artist. She persuaded Peter to let her friend do the artwork despite an EMI policy that required his own art department to do it. And Peter would go into a heated argument with EMI staff, and eventually EMI allowed Peter to have his way. Apparently, the artist had convinced Peter that he would use Marlene as the inspiration for the artwork that had the face of a smiling, beautiful young lady with a white cloth wrapped around her head, embedded into the African map as the face of Africa, or in that case, Mama Africa. And speaking of the cloth around her head, Copeland Forbes in recent times revealed that Marlene's headgear was the same loincloth that the witch doctor had given to Peter during his trip to Nigeria. Peter apparently, some weeks before, had forgotten the cloth at home. She had found it and decided to make it a headgear. Peter would try to retrieve it, but she refused. The hold Marlene had over Peter was so strong that Peter's family members believed that she was using witchcraft to control him, an allegation that was later proved right. And with the passage of time, Peter's behavior began to get really erratic, and everybody around just knew that Marlene's influence was to blame. He had beaten and bruised a close friend after a complaint from Marlene, and even threatened to kill Copeland Forbes after Marlene told him that she was sure that Copeland was stealing from him. And according to reggae historian John Masuri, a friend of Peter's once saw Marlene put some substances in Peter's food around that time, and when confronted, simply said that she had to control her man. And around that time, Peter accused his sons, David and Andrew Tosh, of making a pass at Marlene and disowned them for a while. And even the Wailer's close friend and collaborator, Roger Stephens, saw Peter in those times and remarked that the stepping razor looked helpless and behaved like a zombie. And she would even incite Peter against Bonnie Wailer and caused the stepping razor to point his sword at Bonnie's face one night in his living room. Which is unbelievable, as Bonnie wasn't just an old friend and colleague, but was family, as Peter's son, Andrew Tosh, was also Bonnie's nephew by his sister, Shirley Livingston. And in Bonnie's own words, in the last years of Peter's life, he could no longer recognize his friend and brother. Marlene was aggressive and mean to everybody around Peter and would antagonize and alienate people to no end. And one of them happened to be a criminal and thug named Dennis Loban, aka Lepo, a criminal but an old familiar face from Trenchtown. He was an ex-convict who had been a beneficiary of Peter's legendary generosity until Marlene came into the picture and told Peter to cut him off. And Lepo would grow to resent Peter and Marlene, but it all got to a head one day when Lepo saw someone driving Peter's car while the stepping razor was supposed to be out of the country. Lepo would flag the car down and saw that it was Marlene's younger brother taking the car out for a spin with some young ladies. And he got into an argument with the young man before he drove off. And later that day, Lepo saw the car upside down, badly damaged in an accident. And he went to Peter's house to report the matter after he came back, an act that would infuriate Marlene, who insulted him and called him every unprintable name that she could find. Peter didn't say a word all through that exchange, and this would infuriate Lepo, who barked at Peter, accusing him of having no control over his woman and allowing her to insult him. He stormed out of Peter's house that day and told anyone who cared to listen that he was going to deal with Peter. So on the evening of September the 11th, 1987, Peter and Marlene were at home entertaining a few friends after returning from a trip to America, and while watching TV, Lepo and 2 other armed men who stormed into the house saying this is a hold-up. They forced everyone to lay on the floor. Lepo looked straight at Marlene and said, "This is happening because of you." And after finding out that Peter had no money at home for them to steal, Lepo began to rant at Peter before aiming the gun at Marlene and opening fire, and then everybody else. And by that evening's end, Peter and 2 others were dead. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Lepo, and he would turn himself in 2 days later and was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment. Peter had been killed by the horrible creature, Lepo, after everything he'd done for the man. Truly a horrific coming to pass of the witch doctor's warning a few years before. And in total, Marlene Brown's presence proved to be the trigger that ultimately brought down the great Peter Tosh. I truly believe that she loved that man in her own way, but the personal demons and ways overcame his world and life, caused his relationships and mind to unravel, and finally led to the sad ending of the Stepping Wizard's life. So there you have it. Thank you for watching the video today. Please leave a like, subscribe, and until next time, Jah bless.